It's easy to blame politicians, but politicians are products of their society, right? Like they're not made in a vacuum, right? Blame anything else, but the point of democracy is always that societies choose what they get. There's an appeal for politicians, right? Like if somebody's running for the central government, and if they are to say, oh, you have no schools, however, you know what, that is not my domain, and therefore I'm not going to do anything about it, because if I were to do it, that would be usurpation of power on my part, and I'm going to let your state government do that. Which politician who's aspiring for a central post is going to say that? We have set up a system where politicians are incentivized to usurp power towards the chair that they occupy. And so if you have rigged the game, you cannot blame the politician for playing that game.
Yo, what is up, my friends? Welcome to another episode of Dostcast. My name is Vinamre and Nilakantan. If you are new to our YouTube channel, please subscribe, because we release new episodes every Tuesday and Friday at 12 p.m. Indian Standard Time. If you're listening to this podcast on an audio platform, make sure you give us 5 stars, because we're the best in India. Today's guest is Nilakantan RS, who's written a wonderful book called South versus North, India's Great Divide, published by Juggernaut Books. In this book, he argues that states like UP and Bihar, which might seem very prosperous, actually rank quite low in several important metrics in health, education, and economy. On the other hand, states in the South are doing supremely well. We got into a pretty intense discussion about why the South is performing better, the challenges that are intrinsically there in India's union, and what is a solution where Indian states, particularly in the South, can sort of govern themselves through a gamified democracy. If this sounds complex, trust me, the podcast is a lot more accessible. In this episode, I also had my good friend Samar on the podcast, who's a better expert at most things civics and democracy than I am. So it was a fun conversation. You can check out the episode with Nilakantan RS starting in 3, 2, 1. Nilakantan RS, welcome to Dostcast.
Thank you.
Your book is excellently written. Like I said before the podcast, it's very nice to see actual data as opposed to hyperbole, which has become a tendency when we, go to our nation's more mainstream media outlets. But to start things off, and also to introduce my co-host for today, who's going to cover my blind spots when it comes to governance and everything else that is non-UPSC related. I'm going to seek Samar's help, who's been on the podcast a bunch of times. So your book starts with this, which I thought would be an interesting angle to begin from. If a child is born in South India, more likely to be vaccinated, less likely to lose her mother, more likely to get better childcare, go and remain in school, less likely to be involved in agriculture for sustenance. And you attribute this to some kind of sub-nationalism, right? Nationalism has the bad rep that it has, or the good rep, whatever. But I was kind of struggling to understand, what is sub-nationalism?
Right. So there's this author called Prerna Singh. Right, and she wrote this wonderful book, which basically talks about subnationalism. And what she does is that this idea of so if you take a Tamil person or a Malayali person, typically their identity as a Tamil or a Malayali is very, very strong. Right, that hold that this is my society, and that I partake in it, and that I want to contribute to it. That sense of belonging to that society is what she defines as subnationalism.
Okay, right? But yeah.
And this is contrasted with nationalism, which is kind of a pan-India thing. And she goes on to even argue that the greater the nationalism and lesser the subnationalism, your development metrics are worse off.
So what do you say? I mean, we could argue the same for our states in the north, right? That we would also have some degrees of subnationalism, at least in Haryana, Punjab, and Uttar Pradesh, some rough kind of subnationalism?
Probably yes. We could have but I think what he's talking about here, I can relate it because I was in Hyderabad. So they think that their own state, it has its own value. They have a very common sense of belonging to that state. And I've not seen that in Haryana, Punjab, and Himachal. It's not that strong, first of all. And also, it's not that administratively driven also. Administrative-wise, Haryana, Punjab, Delhi, and Uttar Pradesh, they're very close to each other. Like, they'll sign MOUs, they will complement each other in policies, they'll help each other out. Unless there's some picky issues like SYL.
Yeah.
So especially Uttar Pradesh, right? Like it has really low, like there's a metric by which she measures subnationalism. And if you measure by that, states in the Indo-Gangetic plains generally have low degrees of subnationalism and higher degrees of nationalism, so to speak. But Uttar Pradesh in particular has really low sort of degrees of subnationalism, right? And she, and I talk about this in my book as well. The name Uttar Pradesh is like a, they've retained the original sort of short form of that, which was United Provinces, and sort of given it a Hindustani name, which is Uttar Pradesh. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're saying that this subnationalism is one of the key drivers why the South performs better in healthcare, education, economics.
If you think about it, it's kind of almost obvious, right? Which is that, if you belong to a society, like, we are a social species and we are kind of tribal in the way in which we have evolved, right? However, like, at what point does it stop being your tribe? Right? Like, the world is 7 billion people. Very difficult to think of it as your tribe.
Yeah.
Right? As you sort of keep going, smaller and smaller levels of that. Like, again, India is 1.3 billion. Yeah. It's very difficult for you to sort of imagine that, this is your tribe, right? Like, it can still be your country, but it's like to imagine that, this is my society and my whatever, and that I am contributing to it, and therefore, and it is giving me back something. Like, that needs a much smaller sort of a unit for you to sort of effectively run that society, right? Like, what is that size? Is an Indian state that, by historic standards of evolution, even that is probably too big. Like, a district is probably a better sort of whatever, right? But at least in terms of, and to Samar's point, one of the reasons you probably do not see the subnationalism as much as in the northern states is that, to a large degree, the subnationalism in the south is driven by a degree of linguistic subnationalism. The identity of a Tamil is a Tamil. Right? The identity of a Malayali is a Malayali. That they are Indian is also a thing.
But does that not, like, for example, if the languages are different, how do they then have the same in-group?
Which is important. The Tamil in-group does not include the Malayali. And the Malayali in-group does not include the Tamil. They're mutually exclusive in that sense. Right? The subnationalism of the Tamil subnationalism is distinct and different from the Malayali subnationalism.
I see.
Yes. And at what point does this not become parochialism? And at what so
for dummies, what is parochialism?
So interesting, right? I
had no idea. Sorry.
Yeah. So have you seen this famous sort of a cartoonish depiction of nationalism where they'll have a flag, a religion, a boat, whatever, whatever, this is mine, and you will have the same thing on the other side of the river, and basically say that everything great is it'll be like symmetric, identical on this side and the other side, and they will say that everything is great on this side because it's mine, and everything is shitty on the other side because it's yours.
Right.
Like the point at which you sort of have the sense of belonging to that particular society, and you want to have this virtuous cycle where, you believe in the sort of public interest of that particular society, that becomes a virtuous cycle. The point at which that stops and it becomes about, somebody else, and you sort of saying that they are the reason why, you're not doing well or things of that nature, it becomes parochialism, right? Or more importantly, when your like, how do I say this? The negative connotation of the same thing. Everything has a negative connotation, however good it might be, right?
Right.
That.
Interesting.
Parochial means to narrow it down, right?
To narrow it down to something that's like by geography or size.
It's more like short-sightedness, to narrow it down to...
I'm very parochial because I have a bad eyesight. Anyway. So one thing that kind of struck me by surprise is that, I'm just reading from the broad strokes of the introduction, then we can dive deep. You also mentioned the South is taxed more than the North, and it's probably because of the lower populations, right? And not probably, because you're a data scientist, the probably is unimaginable. I had no idea. I always thought that taxation policies usually depend on some kind of how much output the state produces. But could we go dive deep into why that is the case? Why is the South taxed more than the North?
So, taxation, particularly in India, works in slightly complicated ways, right? That is, state governments, especially after GST, but even before, have very little leeway in terms of like much of the taxes that you and I pay are essentially to the union government, right? We pay very little taxes to the state government, right? You pay property tax of that nature to your local government, but bulk of the taxes that people like you and me, and I assume people who are watching this show, essentially will be paying that to the union government. Now, the union government takes that and then redistributes it to the states and keeps some for itself for its own projects. And the way in which this is done is through this complicated finance commissions, allocation ratios, and grants, and it's through an entirely complicated process, right? Now, the reason, and we'll go into that later, but the reason why the South is taxed more per se is because of two reasons. One, they're slightly more prosperous. Two, they are more the presence of organized labor. That is, as the data in the book suggests, people have moved away from agriculture and actually hold jobs in either a factory or in a service sector, in an organized sector, etc. And thirdly, they earn more for fewer people, right? All of this basically means that they're all taxed. And because of the population and taxation, when the union government taxes you, it does not care for where you are, right? It does not cap the taxation based on population. However, when it gives money back, it does cap taxation based on population.
That's a very weird way of taxation.
Yes. So that's the reason.
The data was also saying that the per capita taxation of Tamil Nadu, Kerala, these are significantly more than the taxes Bihar pays, and coincidentally I remember that there's something about like PTR. PTR he's the finance minister of Tamil Nadu. So he was saying in an interview, so he was telling that for every 1 rupee that Tamil Nadu contributes to the center, they get 30 paise or 20 paise back. And for every 1 rupee that Bihar contributes, they get 3 rupees or 2 rupees back. Bihar and Uttar Pradesh.
Yeah, I wanted to say I really, really enjoyed that part where you said the union government gets about 2/3 of tax revenue at the end, but does 1/3 of all expenses. The states get 1/3 of tax revenue, but they do 2/3 of expenses. And then you mentioned something about how like a prosperous Tamil Nadu is effectively paying for a poor UP. And I was mind blown by that, right? Like, could we dive into using that as a context? Could we dive deep into that concept?
Sure. Particularly Telangana, right? Okay. Telangana is probably the state which is, Tamil Nadu has its own, versions of it. So how do you measure this is complicated, right? Like there are very, very many ways in which you can measure how much a state pays in versus how much it gets. So there's a regression chart in the book that I made. So I recommend all of you to go through that. And if you see, it's almost funny. Like the rest of the states, some of them pay more, some of them pay less, some of them pay a little bit more, some of them pay a little bit, get a little bit more of that nature. And then there's like a completely off the charts state called Uttar Pradesh, which is like on the top end of the spectrum. So it's like we're all working for Uttar Pradesh, right? But
yeah, I'm an employee of UPA. That's true.
But the serious fact is that there are a few ways to measure this, right? One, like I said, the allocation ratio of the Finance Commission. If you measure by that, the Finance Commission allocation ratios are done once every 5 years. And if you do that, if you see southern states, Kerala is particularly badly affected. And because it's been badly affected for 3 or 4 finance commissions consecutively, we don't talk about it anymore because it's been affected so much. Tamil Nadu has been particularly affected in the 14th Finance Commission, which was the one before this. Now in the 15th Finance Commission, partly, because we made so much noise, I don't know, they've sort of spared us a little bit this time. And then Telangana is particularly affected now, which is that the way in which you measure that is if you take all the central transfers to a state and then the state's own revenue, right? Telangana state's own revenue is like about 5.2 percentage points greater than all the union transfers that it gets. That is, in order to manage its budget, it needs to tax its citizens once more. The reason why I say once more is because the money that the union government gives to Telangana is not as if, it's its own money, right? Like we pay into the union government and we get some amount of it back, right? And then Telangana has to tax its citizens 5.2% greater than that in order for it to actually run a budget, which if I were a citizen of Telangana, I'd be very upset about that.
Yeah.
I am a citizen of Tamil Nadu. I'm already upset about a slightly lower percentage points. But in Telangana, it's particularly bad.
So can states not can they not be lended money? Can they not find other ways that doesn't require taxing the citizenry to compensate for this?
Governments typically, when you say lent money, you mean from the union?
From the union or somewhere else?
They do raise money somewhere else, but just like you and me borrow, we have to pay it back with interest. If governments borrow, they also have to pay it back with interest. And it's not as if governments, especially state governments, get to print money and give it back, right? It's our tax money one more time. So it's I don't know.
But I heard there's also a condition in the constitution. So if you're lending money, and it's from if the state is lending from the central government, so if they have any pending loans, they can't raise other loans first without clearing or getting assent from the central government.
Yeah, so they've set up so again, there are. If we say something wrong, then we're going to get really blow back on the comments. So let's be very clear. I want to make sure that we make this clear, which is this is a complicated subject, but there is an upper limit in terms of how much states can borrow, and the union government has a huge say in terms of how much states are allowed to borrow. And the reason for all of this is that the implicit understanding is that if the state were to default, the union government will sort of stand in for it. Right? Now, that's not explicit, but it's implicit. And because of which the union government has a say, which is a fair thing. However, does that mean it gets to entirely dictate the state's finances? That's probably unfair. So it's complicated.
Interesting. By the way, for full disclaimer, the onus of proof is on you as an expert. I can just play ignorant host and just live my life. Anyway, what I found very interesting in the health part of the book is so you mentioned how there are some very weird metrics in general in data science, right? That then become industry standards and then decide something as important as funding and then rankings, right? And then that you can use those rankings to then get your government elected, all of those things. You mentioned in 2019, Madhya Pradesh ranks higher in ease of doing business more than some of the most technologically advanced states in the country. And Madhya Pradesh has little to no industry, right? That's what you mentioned in the book. So what is it, are there other rankings or metrics that we use blindly without much thought then become problematic when deciding?
So again, the Good Governance Index, which the Ministry of it's called the Department of Personnel. It's not a ministry.
Department of Persona.
Yeah, personnel.
Okay, personnel. That's a completely different.
I think that's what it's called. I may be wrong, but anyway, they put out this Good Governance Index. That's the name of the report, right? So it was started in 2019, and if you look at that report, like I said, there are certain. So it ranks or it grades states in various verticals, that is domains, and in certain areas like health, it's pretty straightforward because they have to use obviously what are output metrics, that is if you have to measure infant mortality rate, if you have to measure life expectancy, if you have to measure maternal mortality rate, right? There are these many babies who die, right? There's no leeway for you, right? If you take that, the states that you would expect to do well right? And then there are these domains where, such as industry and commerce, for instance, they have introduced this new thing called ease of doing business, right? The ease of doing business is an input parameter, right? It's at the end of the day, with ease of doing business, you do not actually get jobs. With ease of doing, just because your ease of doing business is good, businesses actually have to start and open their shop and employ people and give people jobs and whatnot, right? And so there's a difference between input metrics and output metrics, right? Input is where just because you have a relatively free reign for any business to come in and open their business does not mean that businesses are going to come in and open their business, right? The reason why
output would be like something like, how many factories are actually running.
Right? Like, how many jobs do those factories generate? How much of manufacturing output do they generate, right? Like, these are actual metrics that you can measure. Ease of doing business would be something like, we have no regulation and anybody can open any factory anywhere and pollute how much ever they want, right? Like, that could be an ease of doing business, right? But we don't want that. But for whatever reason at that point, like, everybody in the world believed that ease of doing business is a very important metric. And they started like using this. And if you look at the way in which they calculated that for industry and commerce, roughly 90% of the weightage was given to two input metrics. One was ease of doing business. The other is, I forget which one is that. But anyway, these two metrics contributed to 90%, which resulted in an absurd situation where Madhya Pradesh was like ranked higher than Maharashtra, Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, three of the most industrialized states in India. So, like, the moment that came up, somebody in that department, like, a bureaucrat should have said, okay, oops, let's change the formula, right? They didn't do that. So,
yeah, that's I don't exactly see like a very vibrant picture of, have you heard about Madhya Pradesh? They've got some great industries. That isn't usually something you hear about that state. You hear about that.
They have some like cement industry here and there, but apart from that, I don't think it's highly industrialized.
Like, again, like, no offense to Madhya Pradesh, right? Like, they have their biggest problem is that they don't have enough of industry, that it is a heavily agricultural state, that their primary problem is that they need to move people away from agriculture. And the way in which you do that is essentially by getting kids to school, right?
Yeah. Yeah, talking about that, Nilakantan, what I noticed, which I found very absurd in the book, absurd in the sense that we have such a strong boner for agriculture in this country. We're always like, let's talk about the farmers. Let's make sure our agriculture is all set. You mentioned in the book that, less than 5% of India's GDP or something, economic growth is actually done through agriculture, and no amount of modern societies were made by agriculture in the last 50 years, something along those lines. I may be mangling up those lines, but roughly the sentiment was agriculture isn't as essential to the progress of this country as people think it is.
Right. Yeah. So India's, if you look at the world and look at all the major grains that are produced in India, right, with very few exceptions, we don't even meet the global average, let alone like, go anywhere near the best producers of grain in the world, right? So we don't, like, we're somewhere less than middling in most places, right? So essentially we are not producing enough. And then if you look at the number of people who are participating in what is not a productive economic activity, like huge number of people who are in that particular economic activity, right? And then if you look at why they are doing what they are doing, it becomes pretty obvious. It's the, how do I say this? It's the job of the last resort. If you don't get anything else in this country, you go till your own land, or you work in somebody else's land, right? Like, and that also has significant other problems, like I discussed in the book, right? Like, agriculture has a significant environmental cost, right? Like, it's not as if romanticizing agriculture often misses this point that after automobiles, it's probably the most environmentally destructive activity. Right? So essentially what we have is an extremely large proportion of the population employed in economically unviable activity, which does not produce enough even by any standards. And especially, the worst states in India are nowhere near the global average, let alone, doing somewhere near the average, right? So, like, why are we doing this?
Yeah, that's a real question. Why? Is it because of politicization? Why?
I just want to mention the data here. Like, it's like 55% of our workforce is in agriculture, and it just produces like 15 or 14% of the GDP. If I'm correct.
Much less than that, if I'm not wrong.
12, 13. Because I remember the primary sector. The primary sector is like 18%.
Okay, so that includes certain other areas, right? Like, I think it includes fisheries.
Mining, fisheries.
So actual agriculture produces single-digit
I think I wrote it down. It's 5%.
Yeah.
5%.
So it's, like the reason why those people are involved in this economic activity is not because they want to, sort of till the land.
Yeah.
It's because the government has not invested sufficiently in their education, in their health. They do not, and there isn't a sufficient environment for them to sort of hold a manufacturing job, which is why if you see those, Punjab is an exception, right? Punjab.
Yeah, by the way, Punjab is an exception almost throughout the book in several things. Yeah.
Right. Punjab is one of those rare states which actually, for instance, rice yields. The only state in India which actually does better than the global average is Punjab, right? Farming is an economically viable activity in Punjab. Everywhere else, it's not, right? Now, and this is where we want to take this, which is that in most states where it is not economically viable, what do you want to do? What would normal people do? They would migrate towards slightly more economically viable activity, right? Like it's the government doesn't need policies to basically tell people do what is more profitable for you, right? Like all of us do that on our own, right? So when we start doing that, the basic sort of criterion for that is you give people sufficient education, right? And make people sufficiently healthy so that they are able to hold a job in the modern economy.
Yeah.
Some of, like when a company wants to set up a factory or invest in a given state, what do they look for? They typically don't look for, government SOPs or tax breaks or any of these things, right? Like those are just after you've met certain criterion, then maybe they matter, right? Yeah. At the basic level, they want sufficiently skilled workforce to be able to produce what they want to produce. And how do they get a sufficiently skilled workforce? It is when those people have enough education to hold a decent job and are reasonably healthy to do that job. Right? Like, and which is why there is high correlation between low dependence on agriculture and high human development indices. So which is why if you go to Kerala and Tamil Nadu, the number of two things happen, which is that the number of households in rural parts of those states which depend on agriculture is the lowest in those two states. And it's also true for other southern states except Andhra Pradesh, like Karnataka, Telangana, Maharashtra. So, and more importantly, if you also see the greatest urbanization is also in Kerala and Tamil Nadu. Right? Like, so essentially what is happening is that Tamil Nadu, for instance, like roughly half the population is classified as urban, and even in those in the set of population that is still classified as rural, the least amount of people depend on agriculture. They do non-agricultural things despite
even as rural populations,
right? So this is the basic problem, which is that at least these two states have kind of sort of started moving people into non-agricultural things, whereas if you look into the Indo-Gangetic plains, they have very large rural populations, and a very large portion of those rural populations depend on agriculture as their primary economic means, which is the problem.
So why do you think that these policies that the South are doing wonderfully why have they not translated to the part of the country that we inhabit, this Indo-Gangetic plain?
That's a difficult question to answer, right? Like, why has somebody not done something is always a difficult question to answer. It's easier to answer why has someone done something?
Yeah.
Right? Like, if you look at southern India, particularly Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Telangana, and Karnataka, these states have, and Andhra Pradesh in recent times, which is that, these states have a few things in common. One, they have reasonable health indicators. They don't let their children die as much as the Indo-Gangetic plains does, right? They give them a reasonable, sort of vaccination path to childhood, have them stay in school for sufficiently long periods of time so that they have an ability to develop, so that they are able to hopefully hold a job of some sort, right? So all of this is true. They also have a generous public distribution system, which basically gives people free food, etc., so that there is a reasonable shot at living a normal life, right, with dignity. The reason why agrarian societies have always been built, especially in the feudal past, as a feudal construct, right? Like, trying to move people away is important.
But like, if you have to name the top three: polity, health, whatever, what would you go for? Is it because I think it's polity of the Indo-Gangetic plain. We were thinking short-sightedly. We were this is easier.
It's easy to blame politicians, but politicians are products of their society, right? Like they're not made in a vacuum, right? Like again, you can blame subnationalism or lack thereof. You can blame politicians. You can blame anything else. But the point of democracy is always that societies choose what they get.
Yeah. Talking about just that idea, what I mentioned earlier about how, say, the North hasn't been able to follow the South successfully. Throughout the book, you mentioned the center's centralizing impulse, which I thought was very interesting because we're in the age of blockchains and cryptocurrencies, and a fairly educated part of the country is now waking up to what decentralization can do, right? And yet we've got stuff like one nation, one vote, one nation, one doctor. These are things that you mentioned in the book. To the point that you said in the National Education Policy 2020, states that have performed well, states that have consistently performed well, have now, they were forced to centralize despite great achievements, which is absurd if you think about it. Yet if the country's orientation is dedicated towards being everything centralized, it makes perfect sense. Right?
Fair, right? Like, so I want to break this into two separate things. The National Education Policy, in fact, is a great example, right? One, like it, for instance, sets the gross enrollment ratio in higher education, which basically means college, past high school, right, as 50%. Tamil Nadu's for 50% for 2035. That's the target, right? Tamil Nadu's gross enrollment ratio in 2021 was 52%.
Okay.
So do they expect Tamil Nadu to just sit and not do anything for 15 years until the rest of the country catches up? Is like, it's absurd, right?
Yeah.
Now, however, Tamil Nadu...
How dare you call it absurd?
Right? But however, and this is true for, maternal mortality programs. Again, there are various central flagship programs which run this, right? Kerala needs to sign up for that, despite having the best infant and maternal mortality metrics in this country. And the reason why these states have to sign up for these central programs is, again, obvious, because the central government controls the levers of funds. It has designed a program in Delhi, and it will basically tell these states, you have to implement A, B, and C in this particular area in order for you to avail these funds. Which state government is basically going to say, you know what, on principle, I'm going to not sign up for this and therefore forego all of these funds. Nobody will say that.
So they're actively signing up for the regression.
Yeah.
Despite education and health being a state subject.
Yes. And there is, so there are a few things, right? One, the central government has sort of, imposed it. It's usurped the state subjects and sort of implemented policies of its own. Yeah. And it's not a recent thing, right? Since the time of Indira Gandhi, this has been happening, right? The idea of education, which was an entirely state subject, being sort of put on the concurrent list was like done in the emergency, right? So it's not new, but especially in the modern era where political speeches get televised, there's an appeal for politicians, right? Like if somebody is running for the central government, and if they are to say, oh, you have no schools, however, you know what, that is not my domain, and therefore I'm not going to do anything about it, because if I were to do it, that would be usurpation of power on my part, and I'm going to let your state government do that. Which politician who's aspiring for a central post is going to say that, right? Yeah. It's sort of, we have set up a system where politicians are incentivized to usurp power towards the chair that they occupy. And we have also set up a system where central government has a greater power to usurp that particular, whatever, towards itself. And so if you have rigged the game, you cannot blame the politician for playing that game.
Yeah.
So.
Damn.
But also, like, education has a huge cultural value. Because as we see in the example of Karnataka recently, they changed certain things in their syllabus, added Hegdebar and all those Hindutva ideologues into the syllabus, and removed more of the freedom struggle mainstream people who were like liberalist and who were like advocating for a federal country even sometimes, and their own Karnataka's own Kannada poets, they were removed from the book.
Really?
Yeah.
So again, I want to make sure that this is sort of that kind of ugly political fight will always happen, right? If you see books in Tamil Nadu, you'll see some version of, like one particular strand of a political party basically saying that, hey, my heroes are heroes and your heroes are villains, right? And that always happens. And a good society will always sort of regress to the mean, so to speak, in terms of this equation, right? And my point is that, at least I'm glad that, there's that thing going on in Karnataka. That is far better than letting the central government do something. Even if it were, like, how do I say this? A wrong policy implemented at the right level is far better than the right policy implemented at the wrong level. And
so you're saying federalism is much more important than...
the structure is far more important than, like how do I say this? Like, even if, let's say tomorrow, Bihar, for instance, magically becomes, sort of has the perfectly right policies, but they were designed in Delhi and implemented in Bihar, that's a recipe for, even if it works well, it's a recipe for short-term success. It will not sustain, right? So you would rather have Bihar sort of struggle over the long term and sort of find its own equilibrium rather than somebody else doing it for it.
Yeah, you mentioned Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Jharkhand have almost half their children under 5 years of age showing stunted growth. Yes. These are the same states that also have high child mortality, right? Now, I've been driving past places in the city and I keep seeing the midday meal boards every now and then. I've been seeing them for years because I didn't go to a government school. That was something that didn't really cross my purview beyond just seeing them as boards. But it seems to me that is a pretty important policy. And states who are successful at that also have kids who end up staying in school. States who are bad at that, who don't have enough food in schools, right? I did not know that those two things could work very well, suffer the same problems that they do.
Yeah, and one of the biggest, again, we discussed why is Tamil Nadu successful like a while ago, right? Like, it's an entire accident of the midday meal scheme. A pleasant, positive accident, but an entirely accidental thing. Like, nobody, when the then Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu launched the midday meal scheme, he was not thinking about, I'm going to increase the gross enrollment ratio of, women, that is girls in schools, and therefore they will result in higher female labor force participation, which in turn will basically result in a higher per capita income, and therefore, we will have all these knock-on effects. I don't think he was thinking about any of those. He thought it was a moral issue that we need to feed children. Right? It just happened to be the right policy. The point I'm trying to make is each state should be allowed that luxury of making that decision at its level. Some of them will work, some of them will fail. But the point is that what works can be at least copied by other states. Like the midday meal scheme was copied by, neighboring southern states, which was okay. But then, in the early 21st century, the Supreme Court basically, in a little bit of judicial activism, sort of made that all states do that. If you do that and transport it without, let's say, that state sort of... The midday meal scheme in Tamil politics is sort of a touchstone. No chief minister can ever, sort of undo it.
Yeah.
Right? It's an emotionally important thing. Right? For the scheme to be successful, it needs to be that in the psyche of the voter. And if it is not that, it will become some bureaucratic thing that, so if you just transport that to the Indo-Gangetic plains without thinking sufficiently about it, if the voter is not sufficiently invested in it, the scheme will fail, right? And so states should be doing what they want and what their voters think they want. That's the reason why we have a democracy, right?
Yeah. That's why I find that sometimes brands are better at localizing their international product lines than, say, governments. Because if you look at McDonald's, when they came to India, they had a veg-only menu that made for India, which was the first of its kind. Same with the streaming giant Mubi. They have one directory for everywhere else in the world, but they realized if you were coming to India, we can't show art house films to first-time OTT buyers. So we have to give them old art house Hindi films. So these are just small decisions that they made where they can... Glocalization, right? Where they contextualized their strategies for this country. And if we can't do the same for policy, we run the risk of at least we are governing it from one place. Everyone else can just, suffer.
I think the point that you were making, it's essentially also that the democracy is getting flawed again.
I thought a mic just closer to your face.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's again a top-down thing. And for policies, for people to be invested in policies, they have to come from the people itself.
Yeah, if you and again, like that is the, I talk about that in the last third of the book as well, right? Like, Plato's idea of a perfect system of government was having a philosopher king, right? Like, but it's I don't know. It will never work in an egalitarian society where everybody thinks that they're equal, including the philosopher king.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's so in such a society, the idea is that not only is good policy what is, you sit in an ivory tower and sort of have solved complex partial differential equations and therefore arrived at, this is the best thing. But that should be sold, the people who vote for you should also buy that it is the best thing. Unless they do that, it's never going to work. And which is why, that kind of, like how the midday meal scheme is sort of emotionally connected to the Tamil psyche. Like we need policies like that, right? And it's also true that the midday meal scheme has sort of outlived its usefulness, at least in Tamil society, right? We probably need to move to something else, which is why the incumbent chief minister started a breakfast scheme, which is, it's complicated. He's trying something. Good luck to him, but we'll find out.
Yeah. I'm reading a book called The Dictator's Handbook, which talks about how all votes are not equal and basically brings it down to generalized votes, influential votes, and then essential votes, right? Something like the US has a popular vote, but does that really matter? Not really, because the essential vote is not even the electoral college. It's the people in your party who you need to grease to really make it happen, right? In India, we've got something similar. We've got something exactly opposite where the popular vote has a lot of value, right? But then once you go to a policy level, that voter doesn't really have a right to say, hey, maybe I want a midday meal scheme in my society. It's more like the government chooses everything for you. But, yeah.
That is the entire reason the last third of the book exists, which is gamified direct democracy.
Yeah. Dude, is that a startup? Because I was like, gamified direct democracy. What the hell is happening here?
So, do you want to go there now? Or?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So before that, we have a system where, it's a deeply flawed system, right? Like the kind of Westminster system that we have evolved in sort of between what was, the Magna Carta and the English Civil War, somewhere between 12.
You mentioned Magna Carta. Can we also describe that before we go on? Because,
basically, so long story short, a bunch of barons and whatever, tenants in chief and things, people of that nature, essentially wanted the monarch, the King of England, to not be a tyrant and continuously tax them, right? So there was this evolution in those late Middle Ages wherein they, the idea of a parliament as a check to the absolute, tyranny of the king, so on. So what we now call rule of law and a kind of representative democracy emerged in that system, that is at least in the Westminster system, right? Now, but however, we need to, what we have, if you now look at and analyze the parliamentary system that we now have, which is that, that we elect MPs, the MPs then belong to certain parties. The MPs in my state, if I elect an MP, and if you in your state elect an MP, and both of them belong to the same party, it's very likely that neither of our votes are going to count. Whose vote, and they are not going to vote either based on your preference or my preference, right? Those two guys who represent us in the Lok Sabha. Instead, whom they're going to vote based on is the, what their party whip or president says. Because we have what is the anti-defection law, right? If you sort of look closely,
but isn't that true across the world?
That's okay. So it's not strictly true across the world. For instance, if you take the American, system, like individual members of Congress can vote on their conscience. But like I argue in the book, some version of this is true across the world, right? But in India, it's a little bit extreme because we have this anti-defection law. But the point I want to make is that the transmission efficiency of a vote in such a representative system, regardless of what kind of democracy that you have, is bad. In India, it's extremely bad, right? In most countries, it's bad. In India, it's extremely bad because of the sheer size of this country.
Yeah, and look at the emotional value we attach to voting, especially in rural India.
Yeah, and oh, really? Okay, I didn't know that.
Isn't that true in the north? We really, really attach like a very significant emotional value.
I don't know. It depends on elections to elections, because I've seen like people before 2014 election, the general Lok Sabha election, they were not that interested, and it shows in the
voter turnouts.
Voter turnout also. But 2014,
maybe I'm just
no.
influenced
You're
by
right.
hyperbole
Also,
then.
you're right. Also, so 2014, 2019, they saw a god figure Modi. He was like, everyone wanted to like vote now.
Yeah.
And there was significant turn up in the voters also.
Anyway.
So the point I want to make here is, so there is that loss of transmission efficiency of your choice. So I want midday meals. I want, let's say, greater federalism, and I want, I don't know, India's policy in the South China Sea to be something, right? Like whatever. Like I will have n number of policy.
Just like people in the US can vote on Proposition 4, Proposition 16.
Right. So again, those are ballot initiatives, right? We do not have ballot initiatives in this country, right? So the point I want to make is the transmission efficiency of democracy is generally bad. Now, it's made worse by India's size and scale. And then on top of that, we have party structures which further complicate it. So what do you do? Like all of these problems are in some way, shape or form a symptom. Like what we have discussed thus far, all these problems are a symptom of a poor transmission efficiency of our vote. If my choices were well represented in the way in which we are governed, it would mean that my policy preferences will become the law of the land, right? Now, why is that not happening? It's not happening because the transmission efficiency of the system is pretty bad. How do you fix that? That is what is gamified direct democracy. Right? So we can...
Could there be like other reasons as well? Like supposedly we're talking about anti-defection law. So there were anti-defection law, for whoever doesn't know, it makes the party MPs or the party MLAs governed by the whip. If they are not voting certainly in a certain manner for a legislation, they are supposed to be disqualified. And it's highly controlled by the speaker. The speaker will decide when they will get disqualified. It's supposed to be under the judicial control of the judiciary. Like judiciary can inquire about the decision of the speaker. But they were people were asking for recent changes in anti-defection law. So they were asking that the certain parts where like the stability of the government is not dependent. So they will change that. So in regular laws, the MPs, MLAs can vote against the government. Their own MLAs
without suffering any
disqualification. That was they were advocacy for that.
So that is the problem, right? Like so in the UK, it's true. Like in very many Westminster system democracies, individual MPs can vote against their own party
without suffering disqualification or ridicule.
That is the second part.
Not
is the
about
more important, right? Like so here is the more important point, right? Like which is without suffering disqualification. That's true in most countries. The actual problem is that if you belong to a party and you want to vote against it all the time, when the party comes to power, are you going to be given an important job?
No.
So therefore, politicians are just like us. I respond to my boss sort of giving me a performance appraisal. Just like that, a politician is going to respond to his boss giving him a ministerial position, right? So even in those countries where it is legal for these people to vote against their own party, they generally don't, because at the end of the day, politicians are career, politicians, which means that they want a better job.
Yeah. They should have LinkedIn.
I want to mention something here. We see the rise of Narendra Modi, and like his actions were like way against the party. 2002, everything was like at that time. Also, even Advani was advocating like you should be going more for
if you're
dharma.
As talented as he is and you're able to move masses to, at the end of the day, political parties also exist to win elections, right? Regardless of whether, you sort of like the guy or not, if the guy is able to sort of move so many people in this country to vote for him and bring them victory after victory, political parties want. Like if your manager hates your guts, but you actually deliver the product, he's like, okay, fine, you're the guy.
Rebel salesman, come here at 10 a.m., no problem for you. Everyone else comes at 8 a.m. So moving apart from the data, just like something that I wanted to discuss, because you still are a Tamil man, right? So you can speak about Tamil Nadu in your own capacity. I'm not asking you to represent the state, but since the state is you now at this point in this room, you mentioned in the books that there's been a kind of deliberate imposition from the center, not only just in this government, but throughout, since 1956 roughly, to try and make 3 languages standard. And when the center pushes Hindi, Tamil Nadu responds back fiercely, as it should. But then the center requires that at least one of them should be Sanskrit. Now, this whole muddled idea of imposing language, I know it's close to people's hearts. I've seen Kamal Hassan speak about it a bunch of times. How does it feel like to you? Like, does it make sense to you? Does it not make you feel like I should probably push a language back to the center? Why don't you do this instead?
I think this is amusing, right? Because we thought the language wars have been like done and dusted. Like when C.N. Annadurai famously said, every school in this country teaches, children, right? And it also make every school teach English along with, whatever your native
state languages, yeah.
Right? And if all schools do that, the Tamil child will know English and Tamil. The child in this part of the country will know Hindi and English, right? And so if you want a linked language, and if there is English, like C.N. Annadurai famously said, if we have to learn, English to talk to the rest of the world and Hindi to talk to you, why does the big dog need the big door and small dog need the small door? Why can't the small dog walk through the big door is what he asked, which is, it's trivially obvious, but, we thought this language wars were won in the, late 60s, but seems to resurface every time. I can understand why it resurfaces.
Why?
But
I don't know.
So every time a new set of people seem to sort of come to the stage of, this is complex, right? Like English still is associated with class privileges in this country.
Correct.
Right? And so if I basically tell them, oh, you learn English, it has that it is a common link language, that idea is lost, and they sort of see you, they see that as colonial hangover, right? You at that time, if you go and tell them that, hey, this is the only link language, and why should I sort of learn your language for you to communicate with me? It is not, that conversation is not going to go well, right?
Yeah.
So, I guess we are stuck with this rather stupid sort of a situation for a long time to come.
Yeah, it's very weird. It makes no sense, and yet we were discussing, because this also brings us to a lot of delimitation, which we'll get to in a little bit, but it's been a while since we've had like a prime minister from one of the 5 southern states.
That is true.
Yeah.
But like the last third of my book, again, will tell you, I want to move away from this model of representative democracy to direct gamified democracy, and therefore to me it matters less who the prime minister is. And even if we did not go to this gamified direct democracy that I'm talking about, even otherwise, in a sort of a Westminster system that we have, the prime minister is less important than the parliament and the cabinet, right? It's just that we have sort of made the office more powerful because we now have a charismatic incumbent, right? Nobody thought, the Prime Minister's office was all powerful when Dr. Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Right?
But like Indira Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi.
Yeah, they all were powerful because, again, they were charismatic incumbents at that particular point in time, right?
So personal charisma has a really big role in how inflated the office actually looks like.
Exactly, right? So the actual powers of the Prime Minister are and ought to be very limited. Right? The reason why he seems more powerful than he actually is because everybody else wants to be, like, whether you like him or not, it's true that he wins elections. And that is what counts in a democracy, right? And therefore that carries a lot of power and currency. Like, what are you going to do about it?
You would love to play Shasan, a game we were just discussing. You know what the game is?
I have no idea.
It's a game made by this game design studio called Memesis. They're based in Goa. It's run by a game designer called Zain Memon. The other guy is called Anand Gandhi. And what they do is, It's a game where you get to, well, there's a bunch of versions of the game that you could play. One is India 2020, so you have to win an election in India 2020. One is Space 2047, World 2047. Something is USA 2019, something like that. You get ideology cards and narrative cards. So you can use, if you want to be a champion strongman, a truth teller, a manipulator, that kind of thing. You can choose your style. And then when you realize you're losing constituencies, you can adapt accordingly. And so the game is designed to make you more empathetic to politicians, make you understand that you would make the same choices if it meant to, if it allowed you to capture more vote banks.
Yeah. Like I said, again, I have a lot of sympathy for politicians. Most politicians actually don't make much money, is what I've understood. Right? Like, they have a difficult job. They have to, like, if 100 people come in and complain to you on a daily basis, which I've seen actual politicians, when they work, this is what happens. Like hundreds of people come to them and with some problem or the other in their personal lives, in some obscure family drama, like all of this, they come to the local politician. It's a thankless job. What do you, like, if you haven't won really high office at the local level, it's a thankless job.
Maybe I should write thank letters to my district.
For instance, your counselor, right? Like, it's a thankless job.
Hi, great job, sir. Keep at it.
I remember meeting my counselor here, the local body elected representative here. So he used to walk in the park regularly before being a counselor. So he used to walk regularly, and after a while, when he became the counselor after being the counselor for 1 or 2 years, he was like he couldn't walk anymore.
Yeah.
Everyone came up to him. There was this woman. He was telling me about her. Sir, my dog is lost. Can you help me find it? So if you look at his powers, he doesn't control the state police. He doesn't control the investigation. He doesn't control anything. But like, people don't understand that. People don't understand what is executive here. What is permanent executive?
This is very important, right? Because when it gets, like every November, December, like, my home city of Madras gets flooded, right? Because, well, whatever. We built over lakes, and what did we expect, right? So it gets flooded. Like, one of the sad things of what he has said is that my local MLA comes and stands in knee-deep water and starts pumping water out. I tried telling him once that, in the idea of the Westminster system, you're not the executive, you're not supposed to be doing this. Your purpose is to actually make laws inside the state assembly. He looked at me like I was an idiot. And he is right. Because, if he doesn't do that, next time people will not vote for him.
Yeah, it's just that the boundaries of what he is allowed to do and what he should do are just infinite in people's minds.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where the problem lies. It's like...
Yeah,
I think
that's
one more problem.
Sad reflection of, people being unable to differentiate between feudalism and liberal democracy.
Also, do you think like it's a problem of bureaucracy as well, the permanent executive? Because what I see from my perspective is that bureaucracy, they're given more powers, and there are less people being employed in the bureaucracy by the system, but you don't see them in situations where you need to see them, and where it's their job by our state to actually make them more accountable, make them stand at their positions and do the work. Suppose like if you see the our municipal corporation here.
By the way, do you have the same in Tamil Nadu? Municipal corporations?
Yeah. Like,
okay.
That's a system of, whatever, the state government, the local bodies are roughly the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
73rd, 74th Amendment. Yeah. So they need to be there. Like, the municipal commissioner needs to address that why our roads are actually broken and everything. And we are constantly haranguing our politicians here.
Yeah.
Why are roads broken? Why are roads broken? Why are roads broken? And we are like letting off our state bureaucracy for ease. We don't give them much accountability, and everyone that's why wants to get into the bureaucracy more.
Yeah.
Even I've seen people who don't want to be politicians. They come from a political family. They study and they become a bureaucrat.
Yeah.
It's a much easier job. So when I was like, there was this conversation that I was having, and they were talking about bureaucrats, and they were like saying that what is a bureaucrat. They just go around in cars and they just say "Ji sir," and they constantly tell you to how you can skip schemes and how schemes cannot be implemented, rather than actually going through and making these happen.
Yeah. It's one of those times where I'm just saying you are liable to your own views.
But like, what do you think about that? Don't you think like the permanent executive? It's a problem of the permanent executive, even in the police and everything.
Again, like I said, that's far too complicated to sort of like in all of this, right? Accountability of the bureaucrat to the elected politician is it's a complicated question, right? We don't want in whatever way you sort of set the system up and whatever you do, there are costs to it. Right? You don't want a politician to sort of, override the bureaucracy too much, because in a liberal democracy, that's a recipe for, walking down the path of tyranny, right? You don't want the reverse to happen because of what you just described, right? You need to find a reasonable equilibrium there, right? Now, the way in which you do that, however, is that, again, going back, because we have such poor transmission efficiency, neither the bureaucrat nor the elected politician have an incentive to respond to this bad transmission efficiency. Right? So, like, why would they've sort of, like I said, the participants in a rigged game do not have to step back and basically point to the fact that the game is rigged.
Yeah.
It is our job as voters to basically change that system.
Yeah, you can't get existential in this game.
Yes.
Yeah. Talking about specifically writing this book, you are a data scientist, so you're used to seeing vast swaths of data, right? Was it difficult obtaining some of this data? Was it all public knowledge? And then second, when you were writing this book, did you actively visit the departments that you got this data from? Did you have contributions from politicians and bureaucrats as well? Does that happen?
No. All of this is publicly available. All of this data, I did not go to any department. At best, what I did was sometimes they would put up data in PDF, old scanned versions of documents on PDF files. So I had to write a little Python script to fetch the data from that. But otherwise, I didn't do much.
Yeah, so that made it easier that you had a skill level. You already had a skill as a data scientist, so it was easier to get the data.
I assume most college-educated people have the skill level to basically look at data and transfer.
No, what I mean by that is, because one of the things that he mentioned, right, like how specifically you could say that certain Anganwadi schools and then in physical buildings, something as specific as that, it's not something, say, like a standard economist or a general writer and journalist can arrive at. That's what I'm trying to ask.
Okay, that's very kind of you to say that, but I think they would all do this.
I see.
Because I actually read the Hindu, I read the editorial always, and they're like very specific data and everything, but this was something that even I was like, this is something different, this is unique. How did you like have the idea, but were you actively searching for it and then you landed here, or was it like that?
I just want to say this, right? Like, we don't give academics enough credit. A lot of people have published multiple papers in some obscure corner of the book. One table in my book would be their entire paper, right?
Yeah.
So things of that nature, right? So, or for that matter, they would basically talk about it without giving the data. So I would read that paper and then think about it and then go search and figure out where I can get that data. And because, like he said, probably, I can write Python scripts because that's what I do for a living. I had that skill to get that, maybe not. I don't know.
So a counter to the wonderful, well-to-do performance of the South, I noticed that Karnataka has a particularly hard time keeping their students in senior secondary school and colleges, right? To play devil's advocate, did you find that despite the South performing overwhelmingly better, were there problems where it performed worse than the North?
For instance, in yields in agriculture, for instance, the South has a lot to learn from Punjab, right? Now, you could argue that, Punjab is just destroying its environment in search of higher yields. But again, that's a complex bargain that societies have to make. And for instance, Maharashtra is, what is Maharashtra? Is it a peninsular state? Is it a southern state? Is it a western state? I don't know. But Maharashtra is generally done well, right? Again, the problem generally stems from, I guess, West Bengal, in some areas. West Bengal does reasonably well in some areas, but does poorly in others. But like that's what I'm saying. The Indo-Gangetic plains have a problem of governance, right? Whereas, but no, Haryana, Punjab, these states don't have that problem to the degree that Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Rajasthan have, right? Like, so it's even in the northern bucket in the Indo-Gangetic plains, it's not, all states are not the same. Punjab and Haryana do reasonably well. Yeah. And in fact, Haryana, the one disappointment that I have with Haryana is that for its degree of prosperity, it doesn't do as well as it can in certain areas, right? It can do a lot better, but it doesn't. Which sort of, especially in education, where it can retain a lot more kids in school, it can like sort of get a lot more kids into college, it doesn't do as well as it could. But otherwise, Haryana and Punjab are reasonably well administered states.
Right. I also noticed in the book, at some point, West Bengal was a pretty rich state. What happened?
I've wondered. Both in literacy, in economy, West Bengal at the time of independence was a prosperous state by Indian standards, and then it seems to have just sunk. And you can blame its politics, you can blame multiple other things, but the fact is that it used to be the most literate state, next only to Kerala, or at least on par with it, right? Like right now, it's a middling state. Same with its per capita income. It used to be almost as rich or richer than Haryana, but it's not anymore, right? So why has that happened? Like, there are better qualified economists than I am to answer that question.
Well, you can answer one thing about the GST, which is a thorn in my side, because I've been paying a lot of it. I have no problems with it, but life used to be a lot simpler when you had different taxes that you could easily, now you're paying GST in every single thing, roughly. And I'll just say, like, as myself, I'm not going to argue as like a big businessman who has a thriving business worth crores, right? You have to hire a bookkeeper. You have to have a specific GST CA, right? Then you have to keep track of all the transactions. You have to file returns twice a month, once for purchases, once for sales. And it's absurd. You just pay or get, and I'm going to get slaughtered for this, I don't care because it's a personal problem. Life was a lot better before GST. And when I read that, I was like, thank God someone said it. Like, let it be. It should be totally okay to criticize economic policies that the government makes because it's made for their convenience. And everyone else who's in the CA business will tell you, no, GST is great. It's great for all of us. It's better. They always start lauding new policies as you should be an accomplice in it because it's for your own benefit. I don't see why. It's destroyed my peace of mind, right? Yeah. So I wanted you to comment on what you thought was the problem with GST.
So GST's basic idea is deeply anti-federal, right? So what is the foundational idea of GST? It is that you want to, so the way in which it works is that it moves the taxation from the point of production to the point of sale. Right? If you're a manufacturing state, what that means is that, let's say something is manufactured in Maharashtra and then it is sold in Bihar. What the GST does is that it moves much of the taxation from Maharashtra to Bihar. Right? That's where
there will be no excise duty.
Right.
At the point of manufacturing, and then where will be consuming for like a bar of soap?
Right.
We'll pay the taxes there. And taxes will be collected.
So consumers pay what manufacturers should pay.
Not should pay, and then you link it back, do whatever this complex thing, right? But the problem in that is that, and by design, the idea is that and what does this do? it basically gives the original idea is that it creates centers of excellence in manufacturing so that the rest of the country can be treated as a market. So earlier what would happen was that, if you in the earlier tax system, what would happen is that, let's say Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra, though they sort of are next to each other, they would basically have, Madhya Pradesh would probably impose a certain taxes on products that were manufactured in Maharashtra so that it could protect its own sort of whatever, industry, some toilet manufacturing, some soap manufacturing, whatever, right? Now, what this GST does is that it removes Madhya Pradesh's ability to do that, right? So, by virtue of that, what would happen is that Maharashtra, by virtue of already being a reasonably well-established manufacturing state, will manufacture even more and sell those products to Madhya Pradesh at the expense of what would have been Madhya Pradesh's fledgling, probably poorly efficient manufacturing units, because it's not a good manufacturing base. But if Madhya Pradesh wants to improve its manufacturing base, it has to start somewhere and then move on that path forward so that it can move more people out of agriculture into manufacturing, right? If you set up a system wherein you want centers of excellence and islands of excellence, what you're doing is you're almost telling states which have this basic problem, which is that too many people work in this unremunerative field called agriculture, and you want to move more and more of them into manufacturing. But you've basically said that manufacturing in your state is inefficient, and therefore I'm going to move it to some other state where there is efficient manufacturing. What would those people do?
Yeah.
Right? Like, you've almost condemned people in the Indo-Gangetic plains in one way to basically say that I am going to now give you the luxury of determining how much taxes that you pay on your soap or whatever by virtue of, you having greater population, Maharashtra just being one state. But the cost of that is that soap, by virtue of not being manufactured in your state, you will never have a job in a soap factory.
Yeah. Damn. So it's like you can be a fantastic consumer all you want, but if you want to increase your income, good luck, you have to migrate.
Yeah.
You're disincentivized.
Which is a tragedy of sorts, right? Now, that is for the consuming states. For the manufacturing states, what it does is they lose their power of taxation. Right? Because all these GST taxes are set by this, what is called the GST Council, and the way in which it's set up is really weird, right? Like, so what happens is every state has one vote, and the central government has one vote plus a veto.
Damn.
Okay? So, again, it's absurd. The central government can basically arm twist anybody into doing anything, but let's assume that the central government did not do that and were acting in good faith. Even if it did, what would happen is that all consuming states would basically band together and vote as a block. And because the entire design purpose was to isolate and create these centers of excellence, the number of manufacturing states are going to be very low. So the consuming states will get to say what the taxes are going to be, even if the central government were not, thumbing the scales, so to speak, which it does, and that's a different argument which I talk about in the book. But even if it did not, and if it were a good faith actor, the GST Council is problematic.
Damn.
But there was this recent Supreme Court ruling about GST Council where the council rates were not applicable to states if they don't want to.
That is true. I don't know. It's a recent ruling. I don't quite understand how it works. So, the ignorance there. Yes.
Yeah. Well, we don't have a fact check, so we're just going to have to go on our feelings now. So probably one of the biggest things that we haven't mentioned so far is the population growth problem, and that links to delimitation, right? Now, based on our previous discussion, me and Samar and I were having a discussion about why Uttar Pradesh will have more political representation than, say, the South, even though you mentioned that the South sends far more MPs to represent in the Lok Sabha, even though it's geographically tinier.
Okay. So what happened was, in some ways we live in Indira Gandhi's world, right? So what happened was that when she had, declared the emergency, there was this extremely illiberal piece of law amendment, 42nd Amendment that was passed, which basically had the population control policy as part of it, or was it something else? But anyway, it froze the number of seats per state in 1976 because they also had the national population control policy at that point in time.
Yeah,
right?
Which was sterilization and sending girls to school.
Was it? I don't think officially it was sterilization. It was a national population control policy where they said we 2 hours 2 or something. Sterilization.
Oh, right. In Hindi, where Hum Do Hamare Do. Hum Do Hamare Do is the Hindi slogan, right?
I don't think that was started at that time, but like...
we've got autos in the north that still have that, like Hum Do Hamare Do. Yeah.
That was family planning per se, but the population policy and all of that, there was mostly it was unofficial policies where people were writing it up.
In the books. If it happened, it happened outside the books. Hopefully, right? But the point is that it basically said that states should control their population. How they did that, again, complicated. At the end of the day, because health is a state subject, and states have the control over how they actually implement health. Therefore, population control in effect became like a state implemented subject, despite it being a national policy, right? So, because of all of these, the one good thing is that that piece of legislation basically froze the number of MPs that each state sent to Parliament, Lok Sabha, right? What happened was that that population control policy was implemented quite well by the southern states, particularly by Kerala, Tamil Nadu. If the previous economic survey of India predicts that Tamil Nadu will be the first state to I don't want to use the word suffer, but it will be the first state between 2031 and 41. It will be the state to experience negative population growth.
Damn.
Right? So, Kerala in the previous 40 years, from 1971 to 2011, is the state with the lowest population growth, like 56% total, right? With Tamil Nadu at 70%. Rajasthan, the highest one, is at 166%, right? So, like, for instance,
its population went from, I read the data, 25 million, from 25 million to 57, more than 57, 60.
Somewhere around that, right? Like, I think it's closer to 70 now. It's comparable to Tamil Nadu's population right now, right? So that's the thing, right? Like in 1971, Kerala and Rajasthan were comparable in terms of population. In 2011, Rajasthan and Tamil Nadu were comparable in terms of population, right? So, Tamil Nadu is actually a much bigger state compared to Kerala, right?
Correct.
Like, anyway, so the point is that we froze the number of seats at that point in time because we wanted states to implement population control policy, and we froze that for 25 years. In 1999, we extended that to another 25 years. So it expires in 2026, right? In every other democracy, what happens is that every 10 years, they do this delimitation thing.
Yeah.
Where they redraw
after the census.
Right. So they redraw the boundaries after the census. We decided to freeze this because we wanted to implement a national population control policy. Now, what has happened is that if nothing happens and it gets unfrozen, what would happen is that Kerala and Tamil Nadu particularly, but all southern states, include, next in line is Telangana, Karnataka, and Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh. All these states will pay a huge price in terms of loss of representation for them. That is, Tamil Nadu now has 39 MPs. If the delimitation happens after 2026, it will lose about 6 to 7 MPs in the Lok Sabha, right? And this is happening simply because it faithfully executed what it was asked to execute, which is population.
And other states did not do that? They were not as successful?
Yeah, northern states were not successful, right? Like, how you measure this is two ways, right? One is, like I said, the absolute population growth between 1971 and 2011, which is, Rajasthan, for instance, had 176%. It's true, like, most states in the Indo-Gangetic plains had upwards of 150%, growth in those 40 years, right? But more importantly, how you measure this is by something called the TFR, or the total fertility rate. That is, how many children does a woman have?
Yeah.
2.1 is considered replacement rate. Right? If one woman has 2.1 children, the population will generally be stable. Right? If it is greater than that, as you know, population grows exponentially. So even a little bit more will grow a lot more. Right? So it'll start, and less than that, after a generation or two, population will start slowly declining. It takes a generation or two because people live much longer.
Right.
Right. Like so, as they start dying, the population will start declining. Right. So Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, all these have have had less than replacement rate fertility for quite a while now. Particularly Kerala and Tamil Nadu have had that for over a generation, which is why, like I said, Tamil Nadu is going to be the first state which is going to experience negative growth. Whereas these northern states, by virtue of them having above replacement fertility rates, are, still.
What's the highest? What's the highest one?
I think it is Bihar, which is 3.2 or 4 something. So.
Yeah.
And Madhya Pradesh,
I'm not going to go there. Anyway.
And Madhya Pradesh too. Madhya Pradesh, Bihar have a particular problem. So all of these states have above replacement fertility rates, right? Like, so the problem then is, that's a problem for, these states to solve. But the problem then is, in the Lok Sabha, it becomes a zero-sum game. It's that your problem is being exported and other people are going to pay the cost by losing their representation for having done well. Like, how do you go and explain to people in Tamil Nadu saying that because you implemented the population policy well, you are losing your representation in Lok Sabha exactly at a time where you need greater representation because there is this entire tax problem where, you need more number of MPs to vote in your favor so that, you don't have that imbalance affecting you. And you also need greater federalism, again, for which you need more MPs to basically vote in your behalf so that, all these usurpation of state subjects by the center does not happen. But it is exactly at this time that we are going to reduce the representation for you, which you won by virtue of implementing the policy well. Like, how does this argument hold?
Yeah, I bet conversations in bedrooms might be like, shit, should I have more kids?
Yeah, well,
you specifically mentioned that usurpation of state subjects. What recent examples can you cite for that?
The National Education Policy, if you read that document, is like one giant document of how the central government is going to usurp state subjects. Right? The health, all these what are called central flagship programs. The central government spends, if I'm not wrong, the last budget that Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman presented, the outlay for central flagship programs was like 3.81 lakh crores. Right? Like, again, it reads like a laundry list of state subjects, barring one or two of them. Right? So, in health, in education, in agriculture, for instance, take agriculture. There were 3 laws passed which together used to be called farm laws, right? They were passed in what is the subject of agriculture. Agriculture happens to be a state subject. Why is Parliament passing laws on that?
I think from what I remember, they cited some other subject in the union list.
I'm sure they did. But this is the kind of absurdity, right? Like, in every single area of governance, the union government has been usurping state subjects for a very long time. Like I said, education was put on the concurrent list from the state list by the Indira Gandhi administration, right? And we are still living in that world, right? And recent politicians have done that more because as time progresses, politicians have to do more than their predecessors to sort of...
To save face.
Ameliorate the problem that is already there.
Question. Why was Delhi never mentioned? Did you not consider it as a state?
No, I considered large states. Delhi happens to be a city-state which kind of has a weird governance structure which its state government doesn't, I don't know.
Yeah, if you did it, would you consider it in health? Because they're killing it in health.
Education.
Yeah, and education too.
But it's also, so for instance, the one place where I do mention Delhi is gross enrollment ratio, because I just say that, take Tamil Nadu for instance. It is a large state with a vast rural hinterland, right? Delhi is like a city state.
Yeah.
And yet that state seems to have a higher gross enrollment ratio than this city.
Yeah.
Right? Which, and it's only in those kind of passing that I mentioned Delhi. Otherwise, I just generally take large states. And my threshold for large states is generally 10 MPs or more.
Okay. I see.
Otherwise, I was thinking Delhi would have been an anomaly in almost every other metric.
Yeah.
Because it has higher budget.
It's a city state. It's a weird thing, right?
It's Rome.
Plus, it doesn't have to count for its police structure. That's under the central government and land.
Yeah. So Delhi is strange, and that's why it
must have taken a lot of brain cells to write a book like this.
So here's the thing, right? So when
did I stump you with that?
No. For the longest of time, I was asked to write a book like this sometime in 2016, 17. At that time, I genuinely thought, who am I to write a book? Other people write books, I read them, right? And then with events, and maybe because I got older and more stupid and therefore bold, I don't know what happened. I just felt that this book needed to be written,
Yeah.
And why the conviction in one's heart happens is difficult to explain, but it happened, and therefore I wrote the book.
It is best known to yourself. It cannot be implied from data.
But you say like someone goaded you to write this book. Who was that?
The publisher.
The publisher. I thought like it would be a political person.
No.
The population of Tamil Nadu wants you to write this, sir. We need our matters addressed. No, but we've got a lot of. You don't have so much of an audience from Tamil Nadu. We've got a big audience from Maharashtra, so I'm sure they will hear it. And then you will bring some of your people to this podcast. Man, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. We've had the privilege of literally dissecting your book chapter by chapter as much as we could, and I feel changed, not only after reading the book, but after having talked to you. People can buy South versus North on Amazon, wherever books are sold. We'll obviously attach a link. Where can people follow you on your, what social media handle should we give out?
You can follow me on Instagram at Nilakar. You can follow me on Twitter at PURAM_politics.
Okay. Yeah. And it's been great having you on the podcast. And thank you, Samar, for saying those meaty things about politics that I really had nothing to add to.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Quite enjoyed this. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Wonderful.